another example where I would say it's not a beggar thy neighbor. So the GMO, European limits on GMO, again, Europe would have these restrictions regardless of whether it was, there were other countries in the world. They've decided to apply a principle that is way too, from most, sort of scientists' perspective, are too restrictive, because we don't have any evidence that GMOs might be harmful. A very restrictive precautionary principle says that we should still have, Europe. That's what the Europeans have decided. If there's a harm that's involved, it's mostly to their own consumers. And therefore, I would say it's not for the rest of the world to tell the Europeans that they should not be hurting themselves to the extent that they are. The same would apply to European restrictions on hormone-fed beef, for example. It's a very similar kind of area.
What about patent protection? How does this fit in?
Well, that's another case where I think the bulk of those issues have to do with countries choosing policy regimes that might differ from the advanced countries, because they believe that they're at a level of development where the balance of costs and benefits suggests a much more lax intellectual property rights regime, to the extent that they lose out on foreign investment because they have weaker intellectual property regimes. Once again, it still losses domestic. But yet, we have essentially converted that in the trade vernacular into a kind of a more realistic, stealing intellectual property rights or a beggar thy neighbor kind of an issue, when it's not, when in fact it's not. So intellectual property rights is an area where I would leave countries a very wide degree of latitude and that in fact I don't think really belongs in international trade rules. So I think in the international economic arena, where I think where we could have done more are things like global tax havens, because these are, many of them are, take the beggar thy neighbor color. We could have done more, although it's politically difficult. But if you can be precise in the area of labor mobility, precisely because the possibility of domestic compensation is much bigger, given the magnitude of the gains from trade there. That possibly is an area where we might have done. So there are some areas we could have tried to push globalization further. There are some areas where I think we've gone too far in the wrong direction. I think the main area of global public goods are again, sort of global public health pandemics, and climate change. Those are really the big, possibly international human rights, where the global norm of human rights. Those are areas, largely non-economic areas, where we could have invested a lot more from this normative criteria. So maybe, sure, for 5 minutes, how am I doing? Do I have 5 more minutes?
Yes, we can go a little bit longer.
Just take these ideas and try to apply them more concretely, for example, or think about how they might be applied to the logic of the US-China economic conflict. Just recently, a few months ago, we convened a group of economists and legal scholars from the United States and China. The group was co-led by Jeff Lehman, Yang Yao, and myself, and I've managed to misspell my name, which is quite good. And then we put together a report which was called U.S.-China Trade Relations: A Way Forward. This was from October, and we had actually a fairly good and high-level sort of list of signatories, including 5 Nobel Prize winners in economics who signed on to this. And the idea was that we wanted to, I think right now, as everybody knows, the discussion on China is essentially vacillates between two positions, which I think neither are tenable. One of them is sort of going back to this, deep integration agenda, the hyper-globalization agenda. And I think membership of China in the WTO was essentially implicitly presumed that China was going to become just another member of the WTO with kind of an economic regime that would increasingly converge to that sort of a Western idea of a market economy. Now it's become clear that that's not where the Chinese economy is going, and now there's increasingly another position, especially in Washington, which is called sort of the decoupling position, which is essentially a much more dramatic decoupling of the economies of U.S. and China, because China is an economy that's run on obviously such different principles. Now that the decoupling position has a lot of political, geopolitical layerings as well. But what we want to do is come up with a position that is somewhere in between those, a position that can preserve the bulk of the gains from trade, while also allowing the two countries sort of reasonable amounts of policy autonomy. That would mean, in some ways, pushing back from the idea that by signing on to the WTO, China had essentially accepted to run its own economy in a particular way, and also pushing back from the notion that the United States had to leave its market open to Chinese exports and Chinese investment, no matter what that did to U.S. labor markets, or to the innovation system, or the integrity of technologies in the United States. Okay, so we want to do what is prioritize policy space for both countries, allow these two countries considerable latitude at home to design a wide variety of industrial policies in China, or innovation systems and social standards, labor market policies, but also draw very clear red lines around policies that might be beggar thy neighbor policies. Okay? So for that purposes, the approach that we came up with essentially has 4 buckets. So the idea would be that China, the Chinese, and U.S. negotiators would carry out their discussions around sort of around these 4 buckets, and try to put their policy disagreements in different domains, try to put them into one of these 4 different buckets. So the bucket 1 is one where there is clearly countries would be prohibited from engaging in such activities, and those would be very specifically these beggar thy neighbor policies. So if one country imposes restrictions on trade with the express purpose of reaping monopoly pricing gains on world markets, or engages in discriminatory data policies that promote predatory pricing or rent extraction from other countries' firms, so those are clear examples of beggar thy neighbor policies in this domain. If a policy is not a beggar thy neighbor policy, then the second step in some ways is to see whether it might fit into bucket 2, which is the bucket where there are spillovers and externalities, and potentially there might be ways of reaching an agreement if the cost of this spillover externality to one country is much bigger than the gain that the origin country is reaping. So you might be able to figure out some way of compensation, some way of reining in what one country is doing by providing maybe benefits somewhere else. What I think is the critical part of this approach is the third bucket, which is called the domestic adjustment bucket, is where this is not a beggar thy neighbor policy, and you cannot reach a mutual agreement. So neither bucket 1 nor bucket 2 works. So a mutually beneficial bargain cannot be negotiated. In this case, then essentially the country that has a policy that provides a negative spillovers can keep its policies, and country B is then allowed to undertake what we call sort of well-calibrated domestic policy adjustments with the demonstrable aim of reducing the harm that those country A's policies impose on its own domestic economy. Okay. The key, however, is that the remedy that country B would employ to protect its own economy must be proportionate and well targeted, at the domestic objective. So it's not actually using a threat against country A to get country A to change its policies, or it's not trying to raise the stakes in a kind of a trade war. So it's purely trying to protect its own economic policies or social arrangements rather than trying to get to change the other country's policies. So I think this would be, sort of in principle, of course, the question is if such principles were adopted, the big discussion would be whether policies belong in which one of these buckets the policies would belong in. But I think this provides a kind of a useful language for organizing our thinking about, where where certain policies should be subject to international surveillance, others less so, what kind of bargains different countries can strike. And I think the way that we thought about this is the principles could apply multilaterally as well. There's no reason why you can't apply these same principles in a multilaterally. But obviously, the US-China relationship is in some sense the most fractious and the most contentious. In some sense, it provides these. So let me just stop here and see if
yes. So thanks a lot, Danny. It was really a nice presentation and a nice way to think about globalization. I want to interject the question by Jean Grossman put forward a question. Let me just read it to you. Why isn't cooperation always better than non-cooperation, regardless where the property rights lie? And don't we want countries to take into account the spillovers on others, even if the country has some moral or legal right to behave as it wishes? So I think you have a very practical, the buckets approach. But what's about if you come with a more cooperative spirit to it?
Yeah, thanks, Jean. Jean, by the way, is a signatory to.
Yes.
I hope his name is included here. Yes, it is.
Yes.
So he's a signatory, and I think what you're talking about, Jean, in the context of like the U.S.-China trade would be essentially bucket two. So you would think that in a lot of areas where if it is very in this strictly a kind of an externality, and the reason I don't use externalities because I use the term spillover, it's a broader thing. If it's strictly an externality, it is the case, of course, then regardless of where you allocate the property rights, and there's always a kind of a should be a mutually acceptable bargain that you can work out. But first, a lot of these issues aren't strictly speaking externalities, and I think and then sort of many of these areas, such as the use of industrial policy by China, or the use of certain restrictive technology policies in the case of the United States, is going to be, as a practical matter, it's going to be very difficult for one country to agree to essentially compensate the externality or the spillover producing countries to not employ these policies through either through transfers or by finding other policies on which it can provide some kind of compensating benefit to the trade partner. But the point of bucket two is if you can reach such an arrangement, by all means do so. So always cooperate. And there's always one area where cooperation, I think, always dominates is you can always talk, because I think talking in terms of explaining to your partners why you're pursuing some policies, that's always helpful. So you can actually find out what the preferences of your trade partners are. So cooperation in terms of talking, information exchange, and finding why different countries are pursuing different policies, that always is helpful. The question becomes, once you have that information and to the extent that you can, why certain countries are pursuing policies that are different, they don't fall into a strictly a neighbor category. Is it still going to be possible to work out an arrangement along the lines of bucket two? And I think, the evidence is that often no. But, to the extent that, that is possible, obviously it's going to be better.
I just wanted to know who decides which bucket are we in, because it affects the bargaining power then dramatically. Is there a higher organization to decide, or this is a beggar than neighbor violation, or is not? Or
so, as in everything international, so this is an area where you need to develop the norms as sort of, you don't presume that parties come to the bargaining table with full trust and full shared norms. But you hope that if you have a reasonable way of moving forward, that trust and shared norms can develop over time. So the question for the starting point is, are there a set of principles which both sides can agree on as a way of talking? And I think part of the appeal of using a term like beggar thy neighbor, which is a precise technical content, is that it also disciplines the parties from not abusing it. So if one of the parties explicitly employs a beggar thy neighbor policy, but then says in the negotiations, it's not a beggar thy neighbor policy, then there is a certain amount of opprobrium that would have, would attach to it on the part of third parties, observers, economists, so there are some limits to how much you can stretch the rules. But ultimately it has to be, so this has got to be self-enforcing. And the only way it can be self-enforcing, as in everything in trade, is that you develop these sort of shared norms over time, and you build the trust over time because it's in the interest of both parties.
Thanks a lot, Danny. Just perhaps we can conclude with some questions which which was primarily about populism and nationalism. Do you think that reaching behind the borders was a major contributor to this nationalism and populism movement, yellow vests and other aspects? And using the bucket approach would actually prevent this, or would have slow down the nationalism movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we now have since it's work that David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hansen started, and now we have very similar papers also from Europe as well that shows that this period of significant export expansion from China, the Chinese export boom, is at least partly responsible for support for right-wing authoritarian and right-wing populist movements, whether it's sort of Trump in the United States, the Brexit vote in the UK, or support for right-wing nationalist populist movements in continental Europe. And so this is interesting because it could have been avoided if the governments had taken a kind of a perhaps either slow down somewhat providing access to Chinese exports into the US market or the European markets. Or they had engaged in certain much more extensive sort of safeguard action. It's useful and yet they didn't, because the idea was that, well, we're in this area where you better adjust to the trade. Trade is such a good thing that even if your local labor markets in certain regions are being ravaged, you just don't do anything. Free trade is such a amazing good thing that it's more important. And that's a kind of this was a norm that developed after the 1990s that didn't necessarily exist. You go back one decade earlier to the 1980s, and you had a president of the United States, Reagan, right, a conservative Republican. And then it was really Japan that was really the export superhouse. And in the 1980s, we had a very different approach because Reagan started with all these trade restrictions, voluntary export restrictions on exports from Japan, in steel, in cars, also the Europeans. So there was a very ad hoc series of trade restrictions that were imposed by a conservative Republican president in the United States to limit the impact of trade on labor markets and social bargains in the United States. You go back, a decade before then, you have the multi-fiber arrangement, which again, when the developing countries started to export clothing and garments in a very big way, those countries, the European countries, essentially worked out, US and European countries worked out this bargain with developing country exporters that would limit this export boom and probably also provide quota rents in compensation to the exporting countries. But it was a very different set of norms that, you don't, people, economists talked about new protectionism and so forth in the 70s and 80s, but that kind of protectionism actually saved the system because, it did not, sort of disrupt labor markets to the same extent that the Chinese export push did. In the 1990s, you didn't do that anymore. In fact, the WTO made VERs explicitly illegal and so forth. So I think, this, what I talked at the beginning of my talk about sort of norms about what you do and what you privileged. I think, this is a very different type of globalization after the 1990s, that it became no longer feasible to engage in these ad hoc arrangements, which were economically inefficient, but from a social and political standpoint, might actually have made sense.
Thanks a lot, Danny. We ran over today quite a bit, and I hope it's okay with your further commitments, but it was a fascinating talk. We're very happy to have you on this webinar series. And we're looking forward to your further thoughts on this, given that 86% think we should rethink the global trade system. And I think you will be a major player and a thinker in this space. So thanks again, and I hope to see everybody on Friday when Daron Acemoglu is talking, the same time, Friday, 12:30 US Eastern Time or 6:30 p.m. in European time. Thanks to everybody, and see you on Friday. Bye-bye. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you, Marcus.